Hello everyone, and welcome to the panel. Unfortunately, due to my current living situation, I am unable to present this panel live today. That said, I'll be watching it live along with you all. Please make sure that you put all questions into the panel questions channel, and any other comments should stay in the panel's specific chat room. You can ask questions at any time during the recording, but I will be answering all questions after the recording concludes for the remainder of my panel time. In the meantime, I'll be hanging out in the panel chat where I can read all of your comments and be part of the discussion as the recording runs. There is a script available for those who want or need it. I'll be posting a link to it in the chat now. Be aware that there may be times I accidentally go off script or read things a little differently, but for the most part, other than answering questions, the whole panel is there. Side note, I do struggle with reading written words out loud, so there may be times I trip up on my words, stutter, or repeat things. I apologize in advance. On the script, each slide has its own page or pages to help keep things organized and make it a little easier for you to read. If you need to skip to the script for a certain slide, you should be able to click on the heading in the outline and it will take you directly to that slide's page or pages. I can also provide a link to the presentation itself by request. The presentation is pretty boring and lackluster, though. I'm really not the best at making PowerPoints. Anywho, without further ado, a little bit more about who I am. You can call me either Jay or Victor. I go by both interchangeably. I'm 25 years old and I use he, they pronouns. I've been in and out of therian / otherkin spaces since 2015-ish, more solidly since last year, but I've always identified as non-human. I'm a therian. For those of you who are not familiar with this term, in my case it basically just means that I've experienced all aspects of my non-human identity all day, every day, for my entire life without change. That includes phantom limbs, as well as instincts, urges, and behaviors related to my theriotype. More specifically, I'm an Anymic therian, which probably explains why I wanted to do this panel in the first place. So how was this term coined? It all started with a thread called Coining Uniquekin in an Alterhuman Discord server by a user called The Flying Potato. I was curious and decided to check it out, and read the initial description to discover the OP was describing my exact experience, having an identity that is almost completely or entirely known to the being who holds it, but one that doesn't fit any known species and wasn't something that was created by that being. But I didn't necessarily like the term uniquekin. It felt too, ununique, and yet I hadn't thought until that moment about coining a term that could be used to describe this experience. I ended up throwing myself headfirst into research and thinking about a term that could both succinctly describe the experience and also flow better when spoken. After a few hours, I finally came up with the term Anymic, and the name stuck. The original creator of the thread and the others who had joined in liked it, and it became the official term. Together, we all created a definition that it felt like it really encompassed what we wanted it to encompass. On February 2nd of 2024, we came to the decision on the definition, and the term was officially coined. That said, I will note that there is some variation between our definitions. I'll go more into detail about this variation when I get into the etymology and definition, but for now the most important thing to know is that both definition variations are technically the same, but with more emphasis placed on one part more than the other. Before we get into the definition and etymology, I think it's important that I talk about why this term was coined in the first place. While it may seem paradoxical, it helps to give a name to something that otherwise has no known name. A name might not be important to everyone, but there are some times where it really helps, such as when you're asked what your non-human identity is. Coming into non-human spaces and being asked, so what is your therio/kin/where/alter type, can be one of the most frustrating things when you have an Anymic identity. While most folks can just say, I'm a cat, or I'm a dragon, those of us that have Anymic identities haven't had that luxury. And it's not like we can just say unknown or questioning because, well, we do know and we're not questioning. We just don't have a succinct word to explain that to you. Saying it's complicated is also not quite accurate because it isn't complicated, or at least it wouldn't be if we just had a name for these identities. And also, saying, I know, but I don't know the name of it, so here's this 3-page paper to tell you all about it, is also not the most ideal thing in the world. Not that I would know anything about what that's like, of course. Anyways, most importantly, it's a term that helps to describe an experience that, to my knowledge at least, has not been given a title before this. Anymic identities have always been out there, but it really isn't until now that we have an actual term to call them by, or that they've been acknowledged on a broader scale. And now we've come to the etymology and definition. The etymology of Anymic is incredibly straightforward. It's the Greek prefix a, meaning without, the Latin suffix ik, meaning a state of being, the Greek root word nym, meaning name. So together we get a state of being without a name. Originally I was going to use anomic, which is the exact same thing except with the Latin root word for name, but anomic is actually a medical condition in which an individual has significant difficulty with remembering names, so that was a definite no, and the Greek version would just have to do. My definition is a known identity without a formal name, which may be the only one of its kind or one of very few. Again, I personally place more of an emphasis on the lack of a name, but this definition is interchangeable with the definition that others might use, which is an identity that is or likely is the only one of its kind / type and does not possess a formal name. Now that we have the how and the why it all came to be, and all of the etymology and definition stuff is out of the way, we can get more into some of the specifics. So, how do we use this term? Primarily, this term is meant to be used as a sort of sub-identifier, a micro-label, if you will. What I mean by that is, it's a label that you add on top of a much broader label. Here are some mostly hypothetical examples, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. An anymic therian would just be someone with a non-human, animal-like identity that is entirely anymic. This would be a species that has, so far as the identifier is aware, no known examples in either fact or fiction. An anymic fox or vulpine therian, on the other hand, knows that they are some kind of a fox species, but the exact traits and experiences they have don't fit any known fox species in fact or fiction. Similar to the anymic fox or vulpine therian example, an anymic dragon would be a type or species of dragon that has no known equal in either myth or fiction that can be found by the identifier. The being knows that whatever they are is draconic, but the exact species or type is unnamed. In most cases, someone like this might just choose to identify as simply draconic, but I could see someone deciding that it's important to them that they specify that their draconic identity is anymic. Someone could also even be a anymic cladotherian, identifying as an entire unnamed clade of species, and of course many, many more. It could also be used as a label on its own, though. You could just say, I'm anymic, whatever that means to you. It may have been intended to be a micro-label, but if you feel like there's nothing to add to it, and that your identity is simply, wholly, entirely anymic, that's totally valid too. So what are some examples of what an anymic identity could look like? Well, first of all, it could be anything. That includes identities that aren't non-human. While this term was specifically created with non-human identities in mind, I could totally see this being used to describe a gender or sexuality or any other kind of identity. But since this is a therian / otherkin-centric con, let's focus on those non-human identities. One example is what is known scientifically as an undescribed taxon. This is a species that is known to exist either by physical observation or fossil evidence, but has not yet been given a taxonomic name. It's entirely possible for someone to see an image of or hear the description of an undescribed taxon and say, that's me, but that identity would have no name, which, in my opinion, could make it an anymic identity. It's also entirely possible that someone could identify as a species that does in fact currently exist, but is not known to exist by either scientists or even by humanity as a whole. New species are being identified all the time, and there will likely be some species that are simply never found. This could be due to just being extremely secretive or secluded. It could be due to it being extremely well camouflaged to the point where it's nearly impossible to spot them. It could be that there are so few of them that seeing one is extremely unlikely, or it could be a mix of all three. Similarly, someone could identify as a species that is extinct and unknown by scientists and humanity. The chances that fossil evidence will be found for every species that has ever existed are slim to none. There will always be some species that we will never know about. There will be some that we can guess existed based on speculation, and there may be some that are far beyond what we could ever conceive. A good example of a species that we know has to exist but has no fossil evidence is a transitional bat species. They have to be out there, we just haven't found them yet. If someone finds they have experiences that are both bat-like and also similar to much earlier bat ancestors, they might realize that they identify as one of these transitional species, but since none of these fossils have ever been found, they might consider their identity to be anymic. Or they might be fine with just saying, I'm some sort of proto-bat. Either one totally works. Another possibility is a futuristic identity, a species that will someday exist but currently does not and has not been speculated by humans. An anymic identity could also be a fantastical or cryptid species that is not found in any sort of historical accounts or media. Humans see a lot of things and tell a lot of stories, but not all of those stories are passed down in ways that are easily accessible. One example of a creature that exists in a story that was passed down in one singular family is a winged cat creature called a Cyrax, which, so far as I can tell, has only been mentioned in the Messy Beast article about winged fantasy stories of winged cats, and wasn't even given a full description. If it weren't for the author knowing a person that this story had been passed down to, we'd never know that there's a winged cat creature in folklore called a Cyrax. So someone could identify as one but never come across the name, and therefore have an anymic identity. Or breaking away from species that, for some reason or another, are unknown or unnamed, I think it would be reasonable to say that someone could claim an anymic identity if their species identity correlates to a known species that just isn't commonly known, and thus they haven't come across it in their research yet. A good example of this would be someone who has tried out various similar species identities, but none of them seem to stick. Like someone who experiences traits similar to both a cheetah and a puma, and maybe a few that don't seem to quite fit either of those. Unless they specifically know to research Pleistocene age species, they might never discover that the American cheetah, Miracinonyx, inexpectatus, or trumani, fits their experiences perfectly. If that being never comes across it and no one ever suggests it to them, they might take on the title of anymic identity. Hopefully that makes some semblance of sense. We understand the basics of what an anymic identity is, but it's also critical that we understand what it is not. This is mostly to help folks understand how this term differs from other already existing identifying terms. So, it's not a questioning or confused identity. An anymic identity is an identity that is mostly or fully known by the one who is experiencing it, but it doesn't fit any known category or term. Now, I'm not here to gatekeep anyone's experiences and say who can or can't use the term anymic to describe their identity. As we've already said in the convention, do what you want forever. And also, I think that it's important to maintain this as a quote-unquote last resort kind of term. This is the kind of term that I can see mostly being used by beings who have been trying to dig for and research something that fits the way they feel for years and still come up with nothing. That's not to say that those who are more freshly awakened can't use the term, though. Last resort will look different for everyone, and for some, they may struggle with research and end up taking on the term anymic until someone else can help them with figuring out what fits. It's also not an OC identity. An anymic identity in and of itself is not an identity that was created by the being who holds it. It's something that's intrinsic in a sort of way. It's something they know is who they are, even if it doesn't seem to match anything else in the world. I guess the most I can say is, if it's something that you create, then you could also create a name for it. But if for whatever reason you can't or don't want to name it, then I suppose the OC is anymic, and if you identify as that OC, then you may be an anymic OC-kin. Anyways, all of that to say, it's totally valid for someone with an anymic identity to create an OC based on their identity. So anymic does not equal OC-kin, but could turn into OC-kin or could potentially be a subcategory of OC-kin. And finally, it's not an identity that's set in stone. As a last resort term, most folks with anymic identities still try in some capacity to figure out if their identity might exist with another name out there somewhere, even after deciding to take on the term. It's possible that someday, maybe mere moments after declaring their identity to be anymic, or maybe years later, they discover the identity that finally clicks. And just as much, it's possible that they later discover that what they thought had really finally clicked really just isn't quite it either, and ultimately end up taking on the term anymic again. Someone could also choose to create a name for their identity, and then just use that name instead of the term anymic. So I've been working on creating a symbol to represent anymic identities. Not that a symbol is necessary, but I think it's fun. So this isn't finalized by any means, but so far it's the top contender. If anyone has any ideas for a symbol, please do let me know. I love seeing what others come up with. So this is meant to look vaguely like a phylogenetic tree, mostly because the term started out in non-human identity spaces, but it also just because I think it's a neat categorization system. The filled-in circles represent known and named categories and identities. The empty circle represents a category or identity that is known but is unnamed. And the broken line beneath the empty circle is somewhat of a new addition, recommended by one of the folks who helped with coining the term. This represents how the category/identity is different from those around it. It's not quite connected to anything else that is known. That said, the line is still reaching out to the circle because the category/identity is not completely disconnected from those around it. What those other circles symbolize are other similar identities. That could be other animals in general for someone who just identifies as an anymic therian, or it could be more specific, like other fox species for someone who identifies as an anymic fox therian. Again, not a set-in-stone symbol, but for now it's what I've got. So just for fun, I figured that I would go through a very condensed version of my own journey, just as one example of someone who needs this term. As I sort of mentioned in my introduction, the journey to finding my species identity can be traced all the way back to when I was a little more than a toddler. When you're really young and have a very limited perspective, that means you have a very limited understanding of the things that you feel as well. I knew I had sharp claws and sharp teeth. I knew that I was quadrupedal. I knew that I had wings and could fly. I knew that I had a long tail. And I knew that I had ears that could swivel and twitch. These were all things that I could easily feel, phantom limbs that have stayed with me for my entire life. I believe the first iteration of my identity was Flying Lion. This was way back, like back when walking on two legs all the time was still fairly new to me. I think it came from seeing this guy, King Moonracer from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That was the first time I can remember being exposed to anything that looked vaguely like what I felt like. The second iteration came shortly afterwards, about preschool age, when I had begun to learn more about myself and the world around me. By this point, I understood that I was a carnivorous creature, yes, but one that relied on speed, agility, and camouflage rather than raw strength. My species identity morphed into a cheegle, a cheetah with eagle wings. From that point onward, I actually have physical evidence of how my understanding of my species identity changed as I understood more about myself. I used to draw it on everything that I considered to be mine, like this CD case from a summer camp that I went to in first grade, for example. In third grade, I saw a commercial for The Legend of Spyro: A New Beginning. Up until then, I had never considered that dragons could be anything other than fire-breathing monstrosities, so I dove headfirst into exploring draconic identities. I'll spare all the deeper details, but what is interesting is that the draconic identities part of my life is also marked by what was also the most vulnerable and most painful part of my life. The truth is that none of these draconic identities that I took on ever actually fit. But dragons are powerful creatures, and power, strength, the ability to be feared by those who would hurt me, the idea that I could be the one in control, all of that was what I needed at the time. That wasn't who I really was or who I am, though. It was a trauma response, no doubt. Despite their roots in my actual species identity, they were an often maladaptive form of coping, more than an actual manifestation of my non-human identity. This image is the last of the draconic identities. She was a symbol of all of my pain, my trauma, my fury, and also a touch of avoiding coming to terms with my transgender identity, which is a whole other story. Now, an extremely important side note, there is nothing inherently wrong with trauma-based identities, nor are they any less valid or real than any other identity. My experience does not reflect the experiences of many others, nor am I trying to insinuate anything about others who have trauma-based identities. My experience is wholly my own. When I say that these identities are not accurate, I mean that quite literally. I was actively ignoring my actual lived experiences in favor of trying to force myself into a certain form, for lack of a better word. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Coming out of my draconic era with even more of an understanding and acceptance of myself, I began searching for some other species that would fit the real me. I tried on some pretty wacky things, such as a Wolpertinger and a few homemade species that were just a random amalgamation of things that seemed right and things that I had vague interest in, and none of those things fit either. I finally decided to compile everything that I had come to know about myself, and from there, I realized, whatever it is that I am, there's no name to call it by. Of course, unsurprisingly, as far as past identities go, the ones from my youngest days were probably the closest. And that makes sense. Despite my very limited understanding, My identity was based wholly on my experiences, not on any other outside factors. So, this is me, or at least the closest approximation to me that I can get. It has all the parts, the claws, the teeth, the ears, the tail, the wings. It's an obligate carnivore that relies almost exclusively on stealth and camouflage and speed and agility to hunt and to survive. It's sort of feline-like, but also sort of not. Everything about it is built to be something that is not seen or heard, with the exception of its bright gold eyes. I could do an entire separate panel just on my journey, this creature, and how I know every tiny detail that I know about it, but maybe next year. For now, the important thing is that this is me. And this is very, very difficult to accurately describe to someone in just a few short words, and this has no name. Obligatory disclaimer, this is just one example of a journey to discovering an anymic identity. There is no right way to figuring out that you have an anymic identity, just as every anymic identity is different. Everyone's journey to taking on this term will look different as well. I couldn't really think of what to write on this slide, but just a few final thoughts. I wanted to do this panel to spread the word about this term, mostly because I do think this term has the potential to be really helpful for some folks. Or maybe it's somewhat selfish and that I want to help folks understand me and my experience a little better. I know it's not the most specific term in the world. Saying that I'm an anymic therian doesn't give you any clearer of a picture of what my identity is like, but I suppose what it does do is let others know in one word that I'm something that isn't named, something that may be rare, something different, without having to just jump into my 3-page explanation right away. That's the most important thing to me and to the others who helped to coin the term. I hope this term can help others, if not just to give others a chance to think about their experiences and broaden their ideas of what their identity or identities could be. The world, the universe, the multiverse, whatever you believe in, is so incredibly vast, and there's so much out there that we don't know about, and that we don't have names for. That's why Anymic is here, to give a name to the unnamed. Thank you all for joining me for this. I hope it wasn't too boring or anything. I appreciate you all for coming and listening. If anyone has any extra questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat now. Put those questions in the panel questions channel. Or you can also just message me at any time. I'm happy to answer questions or take comments or even criticisms. Thanks again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the convention.